For 25 years, Judge Cynthia Holloway had ruled over her courtroom with an iron fist. Her decisions weren't just about the law, they were about control. Defense attorneys, especially black attorneys, knew exactly what to expect when stepping into her domain. She rarely made direct insults, but her rulings, the dismissals, and the veiled contempt in her tone spoke volumes. She was a master at maintaining power, keeping the defense at a disadvantage with subtle but unmistakable bias. Today, she was about to preside over another case, one that should have been straightforward. A black man, Jamal Carter, falsely accused of armed robbery, sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped, his future hanging by a thread. The evidence against him was flimsy at best, yet he knew that in Holloway's courtroom, that didn't matter. He had seen how this played out before. The unspoken rules of the courtroom had already placed him at a disadvantage before a single word was spoken. Seated beside him was Malcolm Reeves, a seasoned defense attorney with a reputation for exposing corruption. He wasn't just here to defend his client. He was here to reveal something much bigger. Malcolm had spent years gathering information, quietly building his case, and today he intended to put it all into motion. He wasn't just fighting for Jamal's freedom. He was fighting to dismantle the very system Holloway had spent decades manipulating. The moment he entered the courtroom, Holloway barely glanced at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Reeves, I hope you're prepared to keep this brief." A smug prosecutor, Robert Kelman, grinned, already knowing the judge would rule in his favor. Malcolm simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He had been waiting for this day for a long time. The trial began, but it was a farce from the start. Every objection Malcolm raised was shot down instantly. "Overruled," Holloway said with a dismissive wave of her hand, barely pretending to consider his arguments. Her voice carried an air of finality, daring him to challenge her authority. Malcolm remained composed, but inside, he was calculating every move. Kelman stumbled through his evidence presentation, but it didn't matter. Holloway practically guided him, correcting his errors, the key making sure the jury understood the case the way she wanted. The stand. The trial had been predetermined. That the defendant, Mr. Carter, even started, was the man you saw during the robbery? Kelman asked confidently. The old man hesitated, his hands gripping the wooden stand. "I think so. I mean, it was dark. I saw someone run, but I can't say for sure." Malcolm seized the moment. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness's statement is uncertain. His testimony cannot be considered reliable evidence." Holloway barely glanced at him. "Overruled. Move on." Mr. Reeves' Malcolm's jaw tightened. This wasn't just bias. This was outright manipulation. The jury shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with how blatant it was. Even some of the white jurors seemed taken aback. Then came the breaking point. Kelman suddenly introduced new evidence, a surveillance video that had never been disclosed to the defense. The grainy footage played on the screen, but it was inconclusive at best. Malcolm stood immediately. "Objection!" His voice rang across the courtroom. "This violates the Brady Rule. The prosecution was required to share this evidence before trial." Holloway smirked. "Denied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the spectators could sense something wasn't right. Malcolm inhaled deeply, suppressing the frustration boiling inside him. He had prepared for this moment, and she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. For a moment, Malcolm let the silence stretch. The reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously. The jury exchanged glances, sensing that something monumental was unfolding before them. Then, in a calm, unwavering voice, he asked, "For the record, Your Honor, are you confirming that you are ignoring a Brady violation?" Holloway's lips pursed. Her fingers tapped against the bench. Mr. Reeves, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. For asking the court to follow the law. A muscle in Holloway's jaw twitched. Slam. Her gavel struck the bench, the sharp sound echoing through the tense room. I will not tolerate this behavior in my courtroom, she barked. Malcolm remained still, unfazed. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the jurors sat straighter, the way even Kelman looked uncertain. The moment was building, and he knew exactly what was coming next. Then, the heavy wooden courtroom doors
Two federal
swung open
agents
with a
entered,
loud bang, walking with purpose. The energy in the room shifted in an instant. Conversations stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward them. Even Holloway flinched, just for a second, before regaining her composure. One of the agents, a tall man with a crisp suit and a stone-like expression, flashed his badge. Judge Cynthia Holloway, we need to speak with you immediately. Holloway's eyes narrowed. I'm in the middle of a trial. This cannot wait. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury, the reporters, even Kelman remained frozen, waiting for the next move. Holloway straightened in her chair, her nostrils flaring. She refused to be rattled. Whatever this is, she said coolly, it will have to wait until I've concluded these proceedings. The second agent stepped forward, his tone even firmer. It cannot wait, Your Honor. We have a federal arrest warrant. A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Holloway's face paled. Her grip on the bench tightened. This is outrageous, she hissed, her voice lower now, edged with something Malcolm had never heard from her before. Fear. The lead agent unfolded a document and began reading. Judge Cynthia Holloway, you are under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, and multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The murmur of voices swelled. The spectators, the jury, the attorneys. No one had expected this. Holloway had ruled this courtroom for 25 years, untouchable, above reproach. And now, she was being removed like any other criminal. Malcolm took in the moment, his expression unreadable. This was justice, and it had only just begun. The shock was absolute. Even the court officers, people who had worked under Holloway for years, did not move to defend her. It was as if the courtroom itself had frozen in time, waiting for reality to sink in. The gallery burst into murmurs, some in disbelief, others in barely contained satisfaction. The jury members sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between Malcolm and the disgraced judge, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. For the first time in 25 years, Holloway was no longer in control of her courtroom. Slowly, Malcolm stood, adjusting his tie with deliberate ease, taking in the weight of the moment. He had fought many battles in court, but none had ever felt as satisfying as this. He turned to face her. Your Honor, he said, his voice level, I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial, but it seems this trial is no longer your concern. Holloway clenched her jaw, her usual mask of authority cracking under the weight of humiliation. She glanced around as if looking for an ally, but there were none. The courtroom that once obeyed her without question now looked upon her with scrutiny. The lead agent stepped forward. Judge Holloway, stand up. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. She hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of her bench. But there was no escaping this. With forced composure, she rose to her feet. As the handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the sound echoed through the courtroom, sharp and final. The very officer who had once enforced Holloway's rulings now held the door open for her, treating her as just another defendant. The irony was thick, and Malcolm knew she felt it too. She stepped through, her movements stiff, her dignity unraveling with each step. The doors slammed shut behind her. A beat of silence stretched over the room, heavy and undeniable. Then, Malcolm turned to the new judge, an older, fair-minded man, who had been rushed in to replace Holloway. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Given recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The judge leaned back slightly, considering Malcolm's request. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He looked at the jury, then at the prosecution, and finally at Jamal, who sat at the defense table, his hands clenched together, as if bracing for yet another disappointment. Then, finally, the judge nodded. "I agree. The charges are dismissed." A wave of relief crashed over the room. The bailiff moved to unlock Jamal Carter's handcuffs. For the first time in years, Jamal's hands were his own again. The weight of it hit him all at once. He blinked, as if struggling to believe it was real. "I don't even know what to say," he muttered. Malcolm clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to. Today, justice finally worked the way it should." As Malcolm and Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, the air outside felt different, lighter, freer. A swarm of reporters rushed toward them, microphones extended, cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a frenzy. "Mr. Reeves, how long have you been building this case against Judge Holloway?" one shouted. Malcolm simply smiled, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Long enough." Jamal exhaled deeply, as if finally able to breathe for the first time in years. He looked up at the sky, the weight of injustice slowly peeling away from his shoulders. The story would go viral. Holloway's reign of injustice was over. Her corruption, which had been whispered about for decades, was now exposed for the entire world to see. The very courtroom she once ruled with an iron fist had rejected her, and justice had taken its place. But Malcolm knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. There were more Holloways out there, more innocent men like Jamal still waiting for justice. "What happens now?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet but steady. Malcolm turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Now, we keep going." Jamal nodded, understanding. His case was over, but the fight for justice never truly ended. It was a battle that had to be fought every day, in every courtroom, against every person who thought they were above the law. The reporters kept pressing, demanding more sound bites, but Malcolm didn't stop to answer. He had said all he needed to say. If you believe in real justice, let your voice be heard. If you think justice was served, comment 1 below. If you think the system is still broken, comment 2 and tell us why. Have you ever witnessed injustice? Share your story, and don't forget to subscribe. We have many more stories to tell.